In a tall, dark castle called Raven's Hollow, there lived a girl named Elara. She was just a kitchen maid, which meant she cleaned dishes and scrubbed floors all day long. Elara had brown hair that she kept tied back with a simple ribbon, and her hands were rough from all the hard work she did. The castle was a scary place. Every month, something terrible happens. Young men would come to the castle hoping to marry the Duke's daughter, Lady Catherine. They all wanted to win a contest called the trial. But here's the really scary part. No one ever came back from the trial. Not one person in 20 whole years. Every month, Elara had to clean up blood from the marble floor in the trial room. The red stains always appeared after the contest was over. It made her stomach feel sick, but it was her job to make everything clean again. The other servants whispered scary stories about the trial room. Some said it was haunted by a ghost. Others said the Duke's dead wife was angry and killed anyone who tried to marry her husband again. But Elara didn't believe in ghosts. She had seen the Duke's face when he came out of that room, and he looked like the saddest man in the whole world. Elara thought the Duke was hurting himself on purpose, not because of any ghost. One morning, while Elara was scrubbing the bloody floor again, the head cook came stomping over to her. "Girl," the cook shouted, "stop wasting time with that floor. The Duke wants his morning tea right now." Elara's heart started beating very fast. The Duke never asked for anything. He just stayed in his tall tower like a sad shadow. In the 3 years she had worked at the castle, Elara had only seen the Duke 4 times. Each time she couldn't stop looking at him. The Duke wasn't handsome like the princes in storybooks. He had a big scar on his face from fighting in a war. His black hair was messy and too long. His clothes hung loose on his thin body, because he forgot to eat most of the time. But his eyes were the saddest eyes Elara had ever seen. His grey eyes looked like they held 20 years of tears that had never been cried. "Move faster," the cook yelled again. Elara jumped up and left her bucket and brush behind. The cook pushed a silver tray into her hands. Steam rose from a fancy white cup on the tray. The tea smelled expensive and came from far away in China. It was the only nice thing the Duke still enjoyed. "Take the back stairs," the cook ordered. "And don't you dare look directly at the Duke. Servants have been sent away for less than that." The back stairs were narrow and winding. They went through the belly of the castle like a snake. Elara had walked these stairs 1,000 times, but never to go to the Duke's tower, never to go to the place where Hope went to die. The stairs to the tower were different from the servant stairs. They were wider and had old blue carpet that used to be beautiful. Now the carpet was worn and faded, just like everything else that belonged to the Duke. At the top of the stairs, there was one big wooden door. Elara lifted her shaking hand to knock. "Come in," said a deep voice from inside. The voice sounded like it belonged to someone who had shouted orders in battles and whispered prayers to a god who wouldn't listen. Elara pushed the heavy door open and stepped into the Duke's private room. Books covered every wall from the floor to the ceiling. Maps were spread across a big wooden desk, marked with red ink that looked scary like blood. And there, standing by a huge window, was the Duke of Raven's Hollow. He didn't turn around when Elara came in. He was looking down at the courtyard below, where workers were building a wooden platform. Tomorrow, another trial will happen. Tomorrow, another family would send their son to die in the Duke's impossible test. "Your tea, Your Grace," Elara whispered so quietly she could barely hear herself. "Put it on the desk," the Duke said, still not turning around. "Tell me, girl, do you know why they come here?" The question surprised Elara. Servants were never asked what they thought about anything. They were supposed to be invisible, like furniture that could walk and clean things. but something in his voice made her think he really wanted to know what she thought. They come to marry your daughter, Your Grace. They want their families to be friends with your family. The Duke laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh that sounds like crying. My daughter, yes, that's what they think they're trying to win. He finally turned around, and Elara found herself looking into those terrible, sad grey eyes. What they don't understand is that some prizes are not meant to be won. Elara should have curtsied like a proper servant and run away. She should have gone back to the kitchen where she belonged. Instead, she heard herself ask, what if someone could win? The Duke's eyebrows went up in surprise. Maybe no one had surprised him in years. Impossible. I made the trial so no one could ever win it. Then why do you keep having trials? The words hung in the air like a sword about to fall. Elara watched the Duke's face change through many feelings. Shock, anger, thinking, and finally something that looked like deep pain. Because, he said very quietly, it's easier to watch strangers die than to face the truth about why my wife really died. These words hit the room like thunder during a storm. Elara felt her chest get tight with sadness for this man she barely knew. She was just a kitchen maid. He was a duke. The distance between them was bigger than the whole kingdom. But right then, they were just two people who understood what it felt like to hurt. I should go, Elara whispered. Yes, the Duke agreed. You should. But neither of them moved toward the door. They stood there for a long moment, looking at each other. Elara could see that the Duke was lonely and sad. The Duke could see that Elara was kind and brave, even though she was scared. Finally, Elara curtsied properly and left the room. But as she walked back down the tower stairs, she couldn't stop thinking about the Duke's sad eyes and the way he had talked to her like she was a real person, not just a servant. That night, as Elara lay on her small bed in the servants' quarters, she thought about the Duke's words. Why was it easier to watch strangers die than to face the truth? What truth was he hiding from? And what had really happened to his wife? The next morning brought terrible news. Lady Catherine, the Duke's 18-year-old daughter, had been found dead in her bedroom. She hadn't been murdered by anyone. She had just died, as if her spirit had gotten too tired of waiting for something that would never come. The servants whispered that Lady Catherine had killed herself rather than be won like a prize in her father's twisted game. They said she had left a letter begging her father to stop the deadly trials, to let her rest in peace. But Elara didn't believe these whispers. She had brought meals to Lady Catherine for 3 years. The girl had been sad. Yes, but not the kind of sad that gives up completely. Something else had happened in that locked room, but nobody knew what. The funeral was held when the sun was just coming up. Only the servants and the Duke himself came to say goodbye. The Duke stood beside his daughter's grave like a statue made of stone and sadness. When the last shovel of dirt covered the simple wooden coffin, he spoke just 3 words. The trial continues. The steward, who helped run the castle, gasped in shock. Your Grace, surely now that Lady Catherine is gone. The trial continues, the Duke repeated, his voice hard as iron. Tomorrow, just like always. Elara watched from the kitchen window as the Duke walked back to his tower. The wooden platform in the courtyard was only half built, its wooden pieces reaching toward the sky like fingers pointing blame at someone. The workers stood around looking confused, not sure if they should keep building or tear everything down. By evening, the decision was made. The platform would stay. The trial would happen, and the Duke would continue his 20-year dance with death, even though his daughter was no longer alive to be won by anyone. It didn't make any sense. Unless he's not holding the trial for her, Elara said to herself as she washed the dinner dishes. He never was. This thought hit her like lightning striking a tree. The Duke had made an impossible trial not to protect his daughter, but to punish himself. Every man who died in that room was another weight on his heart, another way to hurt himself. He was torturing himself with each death, feeding some monster inside him that demanded blood as payment for something terrible he thought he had done. And now, with Catherine gone, the monster would never be satisfied. It would always want more blood, more death, more pain. The kitchen became empty as the other servants went to bed. Elara kept washing dishes without really thinking about it while her mind raced. Tomorrow, another young man would die. Next month, another would follow. It would go on until the Duke's guilt finally ate him up completely. Unless someone stopped it. The thought was crazy. She was nobody, just a kitchen maid with rough hands and patched clothes. She couldn't read fancy books or fight with swords or solve hard math problems. She certainly couldn't succeed where knights and smart men had failed. But she could try. That night, when the castle was dark and everyone was asleep, Elara made a choice that would change everything. The servant stairs were completely dark at midnight. Elara had to feel her way up step by step, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone in the castle might hear it. The trial room was behind those big black doors at the end of the north hallway. Nobody was allowed inside except during the official trials, but Elara had cleaned bloody floors before. She knew how to get into locked rooms. The doors were much heavier than she expected. She had to use both hands to push them open, and they made a loud groaning sound like something dying. Inside, darkness waited for her like a hungry monster. Elara had brought one small candle. Its tiny flame danced in the cold air that leaked through cracks in the old walls. The trial room was smaller than she had thought. Maybe as big as her bedroom at home had been before the fire. It had a round ceiling that disappeared into shadows above her head. In the middle of the room stood a stone table holding a crystal box. She walked slowly toward the crystal box, her candle making wild shadows dance on the walls. Inside the crystal box was a simple brass key, no bigger than her little finger. It looked harmless and innocent. It certainly didn't look like something worth dying for. But Elara had learned that things that look innocent are often the most dangerous. She walked in a circle around the stone table, studying it from every side. The stone was carved with strange symbols she had never seen before, not like the letters she was learning to read, but something much older and more mysterious. The symbols seemed to move and change shape when she wasn't looking directly at them, like they were alive. The crystal box had no lock or hinge that she could see. It looked like it was sealed shut forever, which made her wonder, how is anyone supposed to get the key out? Unless that wasn't the real test. Elara set her candle on the floor and pressed her hands against the crystal. It felt warm, like it had a heartbeat inside it. The warmth made her teeth hurt and her head feel strange. She closed her eyes and tried to think like the Duke, a man who was eaten up by guilt, making a test that nobody could pass. What would be worse than failing the test? What would be more terrible than dying? Winning the test and learning something so horrible that dying would seem like a blessing. Her eyes snapped open. The key wasn't the prize, it was the punishment. Anyone who managed to get it would discover something so terrible that they would wish they had never tried. But what could be worse than watching your daughter waste away while men died every month trying to marry her? The truth. I know you're watching, she whispered to the darkness around her. I know you can hear me. Silence answered her, but she felt something stirring in the shadows. Something old and patient, waiting to see what she would do next. Tell me what really happened to your wife, she continued, her voice getting stronger. Tell me why you built this room of death. Tell me why Catherine really died." Suddenly, the room became very, very cold. Elara could see her breath coming out in white puffs, like winter air. She felt something invisible pressing against her mind, testing to see if she was strong enough for what was coming. She felt the Duke's pain like a heavy weight trying to crush her spirit. But she did not give up. "I'm not afraid of your pain," she said firmly. "I've carried my own sadness since I was 5 years old. Show me the truth, or I'll take that key, no matter what happens to me." The crystal box began to glow with soft blue light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The symbols on the stone table moved faster, and she heard a sound like distant thunder, or maybe someone crying very far away. Then the visions began, and Elara saw the truth about everything. 21 years ago, the Duke had been very different. He was younger, and he didn't carry the heavy weight of sadness that he had now. His wife Isabella was everything a duchess should be, graceful, smart, and loved by all their people. But Isabella was desperately unhappy. Through the crystal's magic visions, Elara watched the past unfold like a play performed by ghosts. She saw Isabella pacing back and forth in the same tower room where the Duke now spent his sad days. "I cannot do this anymore, Marcus," Isabella's voice echoed across the years. "I cannot pretend to love you when my heart belongs to someone else." The younger Duke, his name was Marcus, sat behind his desk, trying to keep his face calm and still. "Our marriage was arranged by our families for political reasons. Love was never part of the deal. But I had hoped," Isabella's voice broke like glass, "I had hoped that time might change things, that I might learn to see you as more than a stranger who happens to be my husband." "I hoped for the same thing," Marcus said quietly, finally looking up at her. "But we cannot force feelings that aren't there, can we?" Isabella shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "There's something else, something I must tell you before it's too late." "What is it?" "Catherine, she isn't your daughter." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Marcus's face went white, then red, then white again. His hands shook as he gripped the edge of his desk. "What did you say?" "The baby, our daughter, she belongs to another man. The man I loved before I married you. The man I should have married if our families hadn't demanded this political alliance." The silence stretched between them like a huge crack in the earth. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice barely sounded human. "How long have you known this?" "Since she was born. She has his eyes, Marcus. His smile. Anyone who knew him would see the resemblance right away." "And you said nothing for 18 years? "I couldn't tell you. The friendship between our families depends on Catherine being your real daughter. If the truth came out—" "War," Marcus finished her thought, his voice hollow and empty. "Our enemies would use it as an excuse to attack our lands. Thousands of people would die." Isabella nodded miserably. "I've lived with this secret for so long, it has poisoned everything in my life. I can't love you properly because I'm eaten up with guilt. I can't love Catherine properly because every time I look at her, I remember my betrayal. And I can't love him because our love affair would destroy everything we've both worked to build." Marcus stood up slowly, moving like an old man even though he was only 35 years old. He walked to the window and stared down at the courtyard where his daughter, who wasn't really his daughter, often played with her toys. Does Catherine know the truth? No. And she must never know. Learning this would destroy her completely. And him, her real father? Isabella's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "He died in the plague 3 years ago. He never knew about Catherine." Marcus nodded slowly, trying to understand how big and terrible this secret was. His daughter was not his blood. His marriage was built on lies and duty instead of love. His entire life had been built on foundations that were completely false. What do you want from me, Isabella? Isabella struggled to find the right words. I want to end this pretending. I want to leave. To go somewhere far away where I can't hurt you anymore. Give me a divorce and tell people I couldn't give you any children. It will free you to marry someone you might actually learn to love. And what about Catherine? She would stay here, of course. She is your daughter in every way that matters. You raised her, loved her, gave her your name. Who her real father was is just a biological accident, nothing more. Marcus was quiet for a long time, thinking about what this all meant. Finally, he turned back to his wife. I cannot do what you ask. Marcus, please. No, his voice was firm but not mean. You're right that our marriage is politically necessary. You're right that ending it would invite war. But you're wrong about one thing. What? Catherine may not have my blood, but she is still the key to peace between our families. If I say she is my heir and she marries well, the alliance will last for another generation. Her real parentage doesn't matter as long as no one else knows the truth. Isabella's face crumpled with despair. So we continue this lie forever. We continue this duty forever, Marcus corrected gently. Marriage was never about our happiness. Isabella, it was about keeping our people safe. That hasn't changed. Through the crystal visions, Alara watched this conversation and began to understand how the Duke's terrible trial had been born from this moment of pain and impossible choices. As the visions continued, Alara saw more of the Duke's story. She watched him create the impossible trial, thinking he was protecting Catherine from loveless marriages like his own. She saw young men die month after month, each death adding more weight to his guilty heart. She saw Catherine grow up sad and lonely, waiting by her window for a husband who would never return from a far-off war. She saw the Duke growing thinner and sadder with each passing year, punishing himself for mistakes that weren't entirely his fault. And finally, she saw Catherine's last day. The girl had received a letter from her husband, but it wasn't the loving message she had hoped for. Instead, it was a cold, legal document saying he wanted to end their marriage because he had learned the truth about her parentage. Catherine had confronted her father, demanding to know if the terrible things in the letter were true. The Duke, finally worn down by years of keeping secrets, had told her everything about her mother's affair, about her real father, about the lies that had shaped her entire life. The truth had broken Catherine's heart so completely that she had chosen death rather than live with the knowledge. She had taken poison from her mother's old medicine chest, leaving behind only a letter begging her father to stop the deadly trials and find a way to forgive himself. As the last vision faded, Alara found herself back in the trial chamber, surrounded by the soft glow of the crystal fragments. But now she understood everything: the Duke's guilt, the impossible trial, the cycle of death and self-punishment that had consumed 20 years of his life. And she understood what Catherine's dying words had meant. Ask someone who understands real forgiveness, someone who knows what it means to lose everything and still choose hope over bitterness. Catherine had been talking about her, about Alara. The crystal box suddenly cracked with a sound like breaking ice. Light poured out of the cracks, growing brighter and brighter until Alara had to cover her eyes. When the light finally faded, the box had shattered completely. Pieces of crystal lay scattered across the floor like fallen stars, each piece still glowing with soft inner light. In the center of the destruction lay the brass key, finally free of its crystal prison. Alara picked up the key. It felt warm in her palm, humming with ancient energy. According to the rules of the trial, holding this key meant she had won the right to marry Lady Catherine. But Catherine was dead, which should have made the trial meaningless. unless the real prize had never been Catherine at all. Elara looked around the destroyed trial chamber and made a decision that would change everything. She had come here to understand the Duke's pain. Now she understood it completely, and she knew exactly what she had to do to help him heal. She had won the trial. Now she had to claim her real prize. Dawn was breaking over Ravenshollow Castle as Elara climbed the tower stairs for the second time. But now she wasn't carrying a tea tray and trembling with fear. Now she was carrying the brass key and walking with purpose. She had spent the rest of the night thinking about cycles, how they start, how they keep going, and how they can be broken. The Duke's cycle of guilt and punishment, Catherine's cycle of waiting for a love that would never return, even her own cycle of being invisible and unimportant. All cycles, all breakable, if someone was brave enough to shatter them like she had shattered that crystal box. The Duke's study door was unlocked. She found him slumped over his desk, still wearing yesterday's clothes, surrounded by empty wine bottles and crumpled papers. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in one night. "Your Grace," Elara said clearly. He raised his head slowly, his eyes red and unfocused. When he saw her standing in his doorway, confusion flickered across his tired face. "Girl, what are you doing here? The trial isn't until this afternoon." Elara stepped forward and placed the brass key on his desk with a soft click. "I won your trial." Marcus stared at the key, then at her, then back at the key. "That's impossible. The trial chamber is locked. The test hasn't begun. I broke into the chamber last night. I solved the puzzle, got the key, and learned the truth about your wife, your daughter, and yourself." "You what?" Marcus struggled to focus, the wine making his thoughts slow and confused. "You can't just. The rules don't. According to the ancient laws that govern trials like yours, I have won the right to claim my prize," Elara said, her voice steady and strong. "But since Lady Catherine is dead, I'm claiming a different prize instead." "What are you talking about?" "I'm claiming you." The words hit the study like a thunderbolt. Marcus jerked upright in his chair, suddenly completely awake and sober. "What did you say?" "You heard me correctly, Your Grace. The trial was never really about Catherine. It was about finding someone worthy of breaking your cycle of self-destruction. Someone who could understand your pain without being destroyed by it. Someone who could offer you forgiveness without being crushed by the weight of it." Marcus laughed, but it was a harsh, bitter sound. "You're a kitchen maid. You can't claim anything, especially not me." "Can't I?" Elara picked up the key and held it where he could see it clearly. This key unlocked more than just a crystal box. It unlocked the truth about why you really created this trial. You weren't looking for a husband for Catherine. You were looking for someone strong enough to save you from yourself. That's ridiculous. Is it? Elara moved closer, her eyes never leaving his face. 20 years of impossible trials. 20 years of watching good men die. 20 years of feeding your guilt instead of healing it. You created a test that nobody could pass because you believed you didn't deserve to be saved. I don't deserve to be saved. According to who? Her voice was sharp now, cutting through his self-pity like a blade through cloth. According to a wife who made her own choices and lived with the results. According to a son-in-law who proved he was a coward when things got difficult. According to a daughter who chose poison instead of fighting for her own happiness. Marcus flinched at each accusation, but Elara didn't stop. You've spent 20 years believing that everyone else's choices were your fault, but they weren't, Your Grace. Isabella chose to have an affair. Edmund chose to abandon Catherine when he learned the truth. Catherine chose death over dealing with hard truth. Those were their decisions, made by their own free will. But I created the circumstances that led to those choices. You created circumstances, they created consequences. There's a difference, and until you understand that difference, you'll never be free of the guilt that's eating you alive. Marcus stared at her, seeing clearly for the first time not a lowly servant but a woman. A woman with work-hardened hands and intelligent eyes, who had somehow found the courage to break into his trial chamber and speak truths that had destroyed stronger people than her. "Who are you?" he whispered. "Someone who knows what it means to lose everything and still choose hope over bitterness," she said, repeating Catherine's final words. "Someone who understands that forgiveness isn't something you earn through suffering. It's something you accept because you deserve to be happy." "How could you possibly understand what I've been through?" Elara rolled up her sleeves, showing him the old scars that crisscrossed her forearms like a map of past pain. "Because I've been where you are, eaten up by guilt for things that weren't really my fault, punishing myself for other people's choices, believing I deserved nothing but suffering." Marcus studied the scars, recognizing the deliberate patterns of self-inflicted wounds. "What happened to you?" "My family died in a fire when I was 5. I was the only one who survived." Her voice was steady, but he could hear the old pain beneath it. "For years, I believed it was my fault because I had knocked over a candle while playing. I thought I had murdered everyone I loved. But you were just a child." "Yes, I was a child who made a mistake that had terrible results. But the results weren't my fault. They happened because of old thatch and dry wood and wind patterns that no 5-year-old could have predicted or controlled." She rolled her sleeves back down, covering the scars. "It took me years to understand the difference between being responsible for my actions and being responsible for every single thing that happened because of them. I knocked over a candle. I didn't murder my family." Marcus felt something shifting in his chest, like chains he had carried so long he'd forgotten they weren't part of his bones. "You arranged a political marriage. You didn't force your wife to have an affair. You tried to protect your daughter by creating the trial. You didn't make her husband abandon her when he learned the truth. You wanted to keep Catherine safe. You didn't make her choose poison over hope." Each statement hit him like a key, turning in a lock he had kept sealed for 20 years. "Your actions had consequences," Elara continued gently. "But those consequences were shaped by other people's choices, not just yours. And until you accept that simple truth, you'll never be able to forgive yourself for being human and imperfect." Silence filled the study like morning sunlight. Outside, Elara could hear the sounds of castle life continuing, servants preparing breakfast, guards changing shifts, the world moving forward, while she and the Duke sat suspended in this moment of truth and possibility. Finally, Marcus spoke. "What happens now?" "Now you choose," Elara said simply. "You can keep holding deadly trials, feeding your guilt with other people's blood, or you can accept that you've suffered enough for mistakes that were never entirely yours to begin with. And if I choose to end the trials, then you start living again instead of just existing. You start helping people instead of destroying them. You start believing that happiness isn't something you have to earn through pain. It's something you're allowed to choose simply because you're alive. And you?" His voice was hesitant, almost shy. "What do you choose?" Elara smiled, the first real, genuine smile she had worn in years. "I choose to stop being invisible. I choose to use my voice instead of hiding it. I choose to believe that a kitchen maid can be worthy of love from a duke, if that duke is wise enough to see past titles and bloodlines to the heart underneath." Marcus felt his own smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, rusty from years of not being used. "That would be quite scandalous." "Good," Elara laughed. "Scandal might be exactly what this castle needs to wake up from 20 years of sleepwalking through life." He reached across the desk and took her hand, noting the calluses and small scars that told the story of her hard-working life. "I don't even know your full name." "Alara Thorne, orphan, survivor, and apparently the winner of your impossible trial, Alara." He tested her name, finding it suited her perfectly. "Will you help me learn how to forgive myself? Will you help me learn how to stop hiding from the world?" "It's a deal." Outside the study window, the morning sun climbed higher over Raven's Hollow Castle. In the courtyard below, workers began taking apart the trial platform, their job made unnecessary by developments they didn't yet understand. The cycle was broken. The trial was ended. And for the first time in 20 years, the Duke of Raven's Hollow began to plan for a future filled with hope instead of hiding from a past filled with regret. 1 year later, on a beautiful spring morning, the wedding of Duke Marcus Whitmore and Alara Thorne took place in the castle's small chapel. It was nothing like the grand celebration that had marked Catherine's marriage 3 years earlier. There were no visiting nobles, no 3-day festival, no crowds of servants preparing fancy feasts. Instead, it was a simple ceremony attended only by the castle staff who had watched their unlikely love story unfold over the past year. Alara wore a simple blue dress instead of silk and pearls. Marcus wore his everyday clothes instead of ceremonial robes, and both of them smiled with genuine joy instead of polite duty. The chaplain had been nervous about performing the ceremony at first. The social difference between a duke and a kitchen maid was almost impossible to bridge. But when he saw the way they looked at each other, the way Marcus's guilt-filled eyes had found peace and Alara's hidden voice had found strength, he understood that this was not a marriage of convenience or scandal, but of true partnership and love. "Do you, Marcus, take Alara to be your wife, to love and honor through all circumstances, in happiness and sadness, for the rest of your days?" the chaplain asked. "I do," Marcus said clearly, his voice steady and certain. "Do you, Alara, take Marcus to be your husband, to love and honor through all circumstances, in happiness and sadness, for the rest of your days?" "I do," Alara replied, her voice ringing clear through the chapel, no longer hidden or hesitant. The kiss that sealed their promises tasted of hope and new beginnings. Later that evening, as they stood on the castle's highest balcony watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and red, Marcus thought about all the changes that one impossible trial had brought to his life. The castle felt different now, lighter somehow, as if 20 years of accumulated sadness had finally been swept away like dust from old rooms. The servants smiled more freely and laughed more often. The halls echoed with cheerful voices instead of whispered fears. Even the stone walls seemed to have lost their burden of sorrow. "Do you ever regret it?" Alara asked, leaning comfortably against his shoulder. "Giving up the possibility of a perfect political marriage for a scandalous love match with a former kitchen maid?" Marcus considered the question seriously. His marriage to Alara had indeed caused quite a scandal throughout the kingdom. Noble families whispered about his descent into madness. Political allies questioned his judgment. Some had even suggested that grief over Catherine's death had driven him to temporary insanity. But he had never felt more sane or more at peace. "The only thing I regret," he said finally, "is that it took me 20 years to understand the difference between duty without joy and duty with love. And now I know that the best duty I can perform for my people is to live fully and love freely. Everything else is just politics and games." Alara smiled and turned in his arms to face him. "The servants are still placing bets on how long it will take for you to come to your senses and send me back to the kitchens where I belong. Then they're going to lose their money." Marcus laughed. "Because you're not going anywhere. This is where you belong now. Here with me." "Good, because I have big plans for this castle." Oh, such as what? Her eyes lit up with excitement and mischief. Well, for starters, I think we should convert that old trial chamber into something useful. A library for the servants' children, perhaps. Or maybe a nursery. Marcus felt his heart skip a beat with hope and joy. A nursery? Eventually, if we're blessed with children, and if we are, I want them to grow up in a house filled with laughter and love instead of guilt and secrets. A place where mistakes are forgiven and second chances are celebrated every day. And if we're not blessed with children of our own, then we'll find other ways to fill this castle with young voices and happy energy. There are many orphans who need homes and love, just like I did. There are many young people who need someone to believe in them and give them second chances. There are lots of ways to build a loving family. Marcus pulled her closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit in his arms and in his life. Have I mentioned lately that I love you more than all the stars in the sky? Only every single day. But I never get tired of hearing it. I love you, Elara Whitmore. I love your courage and your kindness and your stubborn refusal to let me feel sorry for myself. I love the way you see possibilities and hope where others see only problems and despair. And I love the way you make me want to be a better man than I ever thought I could be. And I love you, Marcus Whitmore. I love your gentle heart and your fierce desire to protect the people you care about. I love how you've learned to forgive yourself and how you're teaching me to stop hiding my true self from the world. And I love the way you make me feel like I'm exactly where I belong, always and forever. As the last light faded from the evening sky, they made their way back into the castle, their home, ready to face whatever challenges and joys the future might bring together. The old trial chamber stood empty and peaceful, its deadly purpose fulfilled at last and transformed into something hopeful. The brass key rested safely in Marcus's desk drawer, no longer a test of worthiness, but a reminder of the moment when two broken people found healing in each other's understanding and love. And in the village beyond the castle walls, storytellers were already composing tales about the impossible trial that ended not in death, but in redemption and new life. About the brave kitchen maid who dared to claim a duke's wounded heart, and the wise duke who learned that true nobility comes not from bloodlines or titles, but from the courage to love without fear. It was, everyone agreed, a story worth telling for generations to come. A story about breaking cycles of pain, choosing forgiveness over bitterness, and believing that everyone, no matter how humble their beginning or how great their mistakes, deserves a chance at happiness and love. And they all lived happily, truly, and peacefully ever after. Hi there, viewers. Today I'm going to tell you an incredible story about a young woman named Clara. This story happened long ago in a place called Spain, where there were rich people called counts and poor people who worked very hard just to have food to eat. Clara Valero was 25 years old, which might sound old to you, but back then, people got married much younger. Clara lived in a tiny town called Villaseca, with her mom, dad, and 3 little brothers and sisters. Their house was very small and made of mud bricks with a roof made of dried grass. Every single day, Clara had to wake up when it was still dark outside. While everyone else was sleeping, she would walk a very long way to get water from a deep well. She carried 2 heavy buckets that hurt her hands and made her back bend over. The sun was so hot that it felt like walking inside an oven, and her old sandals had holes in them that let the burning ground hurt her feet. Clara's family was very poor. They barely had enough food to eat, and everyone in town knew the Valero family didn't have any money. But the worst part wasn't being poor, it was how her own family treated her. Her mother, Doña Francesca, was always angry and mean to Clara. She would say terrible things like, "You're useless. You don't bring any money home. You're just another mouth to feed." Her father, Don Joaquin, barely talked to her at all. He only cared about finding ways to make money, and Clara couldn't help with that. The people in town weren't nice to Clara either. They called her the old maid, because she wasn't married yet. Back then, if a woman wasn't married by the time she was 20, people thought something was wrong with her. They would whisper behind her back and say mean things like, "Poor Clara, no man will ever want to marry her." This made Clara very sad, but she tried to stay strong. Every morning she would tell herself, maybe today will be better. She took care all the housework, cooked the meals, and helped take care of her little brothers and sisters. Even though everyone was mean to her, Clara was always kind to others. One especially hot morning, Clara was walking back from the well with her heavy water buckets. The sun was beating down so hard that she thought she might faint. She stopped under a dead tree to rest for a minute and wiped the sweat from her face. Suddenly she heard the sound of horse hooves on the dusty road. Clara looked up and saw a man riding toward her on a brown horse. He looked to be about 30 years old, with dark skin from working in the sun, and a beard that made him look very serious. He wore simple clothes, regular pants, a white shirt, and a straw hat to protect his face from the sun. "Good morning, miss," the man said in a deep, kind voice. He got off his horse and walked toward her. "Can I help you with those heavy buckets?" Clara was so surprised that she almost dropped the buckets. In her whole life, no stranger had ever offered to help her. Most people just walked past her like she wasn't even there. "Oh no, sir, you don't need to trouble yourself," Clara said quietly, looking down at the ground. She had learned that when men talked to her, she should always look down and be very polite. But the man didn't listen to her protest. He gently took both buckets from her hands, like they weighed almost nothing. Clara could tell he was very strong from all the work he did. "Where are you going, miss?" he asked as they started walking together down the dusty road. "To the village, sir. I live there with my family," Clara answered. She still couldn't believe this was really happening. As they walked, the man told Clara his name was Sebastian de la Roca. He explained that he had just started working as a manager for Count Antero, who owned the biggest ranch in the whole area. Clara knew about Count Antero. He was the richest, most powerful man for hundreds of miles around. He owned thousands of cows, horses, and huge pieces of land. Very few people ever saw him because he liked to stay by himself in his big house. Getting a job working for Count Antero was considered very special because he paid his workers well, but he was also very strict and demanding. When they reached Clara's little house, Sebastian carried the buckets right to her front door. "Thank you so much for helping me," Clara said, trying to take the buckets back. "It was my pleasure to help you, Miss Clara," Sebastian replied. There was something about the way he said her name that made Clara feel warm and happy inside, like when you drink hot chocolate on a cold day. "May I ask for your full name?" Sebastian asked politely. Clara hesitated for a moment. In those days, it was unusual for a man to ask a woman her full name, unless he was interested in getting to know her better. "Clara Valero," she finally said. "Thank you for letting me walk with you, Miss Clara Valero." "Maybe we'll meet again sometime," Sebastian said with a small smile. Then he got back on his horse and rode away toward Count Antero's big ranch. Clara stood in her doorway watching him ride away, and her heart was beating very fast. She had never felt anything like this before. That afternoon, while Clara was washing clothes outside, she couldn't stop thinking about Sebastian. There was something different about him, something kind and genuine that she had never experienced before. When her mother came home from the market, Clara mentioned meeting Sebastian. "What man?" her mother asked suspiciously. "The new manager of Count Antero's ranch, Mama. He helped me carry the water buckets," Clara explained. Doña Francesca frowned and looked angry. "Clara, it's bad enough that you're an old maid. Now you want to start gossip too. Men don't help women for free, They always want something in return. Stay away from that man. But Clara knew she had felt something special during that meeting, something her bitter mother couldn't understand. Over the next few days, something wonderful started happening. Every time Clara went to get water or walked to the market to sell eggs from their chickens, she would run into Sebastian on the road. He always offered to help carry her heavy loads, or just walk with her and talk. For Clara, who was used to being treated like a burden by her own family, this kind attention felt like magic. Sebastian was a man of few words, but his actions showed he cared. When he saw Clara struggling with heavy firewood, he would stop his horse and help load it. If he found her walking to market with a heavy basket, he would offer to carry it on his horse. These small acts of kindness meant everything to Clara. In her difficult life, Sebastian's help shone like stars in a dark sky. Clara began to look forward to these chance meetings that brought color to her hard, boring days. However, in a small town like Villaseca, nothing stayed secret for long. People in small towns love to gossip, and soon everyone was talking about Clara and Sebastian. "Did you see how the new manager looks at that Valero girl?" said Doña Elvira, the town seamstress, while she sewed in her shop. "It must be out of pity." "What man would really be interested in someone like her?" replied Letitia, the grocery store owner's daughter, who had just gotten engaged to a young man from the big city. As the days passed, Clara and Sebastian's meetings became more obvious. He didn't just help her carry things anymore, he started showing real interest in her life. He asked about her dreams, her fears, and her hopes for the future. For Clara, who had never been listened to or valued by anyone, these conversations were like precious gifts. She discovered that Sebastian was very smart and had seen much more of the world than she had ever imagined. Sebastian talked about books he had read, places he had visited, and ideas he had for making Count Antero's ranch better. Clara, who could barely read simple words, listened with fascination to these conversations that opened windows to worlds she had never dreamed of. The best part was that Sebastian never made Clara feel stupid for not knowing how to read well. Instead, he valued her practical wisdom and strong character, qualities that few people recognized in her. But the gossip eventually reached Clara's mother through the nosy neighbors who came to her door one hot afternoon. "Francisca, do you know that your daughter is seeing Count Antero's ranch manager?" Doña Elvira asked, barely hiding how excited she was to share this juicy news. "They say he carries her water buckets and helps her with firewood," added Letitia, exchanging knowing looks with Elvira. Clara, who had just come inside with a basket of wet clothes, froze when she heard the conversation. Her face turned red with embarrassment and fear. She knew her mother's explosive temper very well, and knew that a storm was about to break. "Is this true, Clara?" asked Doña Francesca, her eyes flashing with anger. "He only helped me a few times, Mama." "It's nothing bad," Clara replied, her voice shaking with nervousness. "Nothing bad? An unmarried girl seeing some strange man. When did you become one of those women with a bad reputation?" her mother shouted. The neighbors watched the scene with poorly hidden delight. This was exactly the kind of drama that would fuel conversations for weeks. "It's not what you think," Clara protested, feeling tears starting to form in her eyes. "Sebastian is a respectful man. He has never been inappropriate with me." The sound of the slap echoed through the small room. Doña Francisca's hand left a red mark on Clara's cheek.
"You call him by his first name now. In my day, a decent young woman wouldn't even look a single man in the eye. And who is this Sebastian anyway? A manager with no family, no past, who arrived here from nowhere. Has he talked to you about marriage? Or does he just want to take advantage of my foolish daughter?"
Tears now flowed freely down Clara's face. The slap hurt, But what hurt more was the unfairness of the accusations. Sebastian was the only person who treated her with dignity, the only one who seemed to see beyond her poverty. "You don't even know him well enough to talk about him like that," Clara mumbled through her tears. "I don't need to know him," Doña Francisca yelled. "A man with no property, no known family, who appears from nowhere can only want one thing, and it isn't marriage." Just then, there was a polite cough at the door. Everyone turned to see Sebastian standing at the doorway, hat in his hands, a serious expression on his face. There was a determination in his eyes that Clara had never seen before, and something in his posture suggested he had heard at least part of the humiliating conversation. What Sebastian was about to do would shock not only Clara, but the entire town of Villaseca. No one was prepared for the words that were about to come out of his mouth, words that would forever change the fate of the most despised woman in the region. "Good afternoon, ladies," Sebastian said with a formality that seemed different from his usual simple manner. There was a firmness in his voice that made the tense atmosphere even more charged. "I apologize for interrupting, but I have come to speak with Clara's parents about a very important matter." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Doña Francisca, momentarily confused, adjusted her apron and cleared her throat nervously. "And what business could you possibly have with us?" she asked suspiciously. Sebastian glanced briefly at Clara, whose face still showed the red mark from the slap and whose eyes were full of tears. Something in his gaze hardened, but when he spoke again, his voice remained calm and firm. "I have come to ask for your daughter's hand in marriage." The declaration fell like a lightning bolt from a clear sky. The neighbors' mouths fell open in shock. They exchanged incredulous glances. Doña Francisca seemed to have turned to stone, and Clara couldn't believe what she had just heard. Was it possible that this man she had barely known for a few weeks was actually proposing marriage to her? "What did you just say?" Doña Francisca stammered, coming out of her shock. "I want to marry Clara, if she will accept me," Sebastian repeated, this time looking directly at the young woman. "I have a steady salary as the ranch manager. It's not a lot, but I can offer her a decent roof over her head and food on the table, and I promise to treat her with all the respect she deserves, something that seems to be in short supply around here." The last sentence was said in a slightly harder tone, clearly directed at the way he had witnessed Clara being treated. Sebastian's proposal echoed through the room, leaving everyone in complete shock. Doña Francisca, who seconds before had been ranting against her daughter's supposed suitor, was now speechless. The gossipy neighbors remained absolutely quiet, paying attention to every detail of this extraordinary scene. Clara, her face still burning from the slap, looked at Sebastian, unable to fully process what was happening. Never, not even in her most secret dreams, had she imagined that a man would come formally to ask for her hand in marriage, especially a man like Sebastian, who was well respected and had steady employment at the largest ranch in the region. "You barely know my daughter," Doña Francisca finally said, recovering from her initial shock. "How can you suddenly want to get married?" Sebastian maintained his firm posture, his straw hat held in his work-worn hands. "I respect your concern, ma'am. We haven't known each other for very long, but I know a woman of worth when I see one. I've seen how Clara works tirelessly, how she treats everyone with respect even when she doesn't receive the same in return. She is exactly the kind of person I want to build a family with." There was something about the way Sebastian spoke, directly and without unnecessary fancy words, that showed an honesty that was hard to question. Still, Doña Francisca didn't seem entirely convinced. And what will Count Antero say when he learns that his manager wants to marry a servant girl with no dowry and nothing to offer? The question was filled with the bitterness of someone who had always seen her daughter as a burden. The Count already knows, Sebastian responded immediately, causing another wave of surprise. I spoke to him yesterday. He has offered me one of the small houses at the back of the ranch for us to live in if the marriage goes through. This information surprised everyone even more. Old Count Antaro was known for being very stingy and extremely strict with his employees. For him to grant such a favor to a newly arrived manager was something completely unheard of in the region. And why would the Count do that? Doña Francisca asked, distrust clear in her voice. Perhaps because he needs trustworthy people living on the property, Sebastian replied diplomatically. Times are tough. There are many cattle thieves in the region, and having responsible employees living on the land is a matter of security. Just then, Don Joaquin, Clara's father, entered the room. He had come in from working in the fields, sweaty and tired after a full day under the harsh sun. He stopped in the doorway, immediately sensing the heavy atmosphere and noticing the unknown man in his house. "What's going on here?" he asked, frowning. Doña Francisca quickly began to explain the situation, adding her own negative comments about the idea of marriage. Don Joaquin listened in silence, his eyes moving between his daughter, still red-faced and teary-eyed, and the man who was presenting himself as a suitor. "You able to support a family?" Don Joaquin finally asked, getting straight to the point that interested him most. For him, Clara had always been more of a burden than a blessing, another mouth to feed, who didn't bring significant money home beyond the few coins she earned selling eggs at the market. A daughter was only valuable if she made a good marriage, and Clara's prospects had always seemed very poor. Having a man willing to take her as his wife, and one with a steady job at the largest ranch in the region, was an opportunity he couldn't let slip away. "Yes, sir," Sebastian replied with conviction. "I have my salary as a manager and some savings set aside. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to live with dignity." Don Joaquin thought for a few moments. The math was simple. Clara leaving home meant one less mouth to feed, and one less problem to solve. "If Count Antaro trusts you, who are we to doubt?" Don Joaquin said, to everyone's amazement, especially his wife's. "But I want everything done properly in the chapel, with the priest and papers signed. I'm not going to hand my daughter over to live together without marriage." Sebastian nodded solemnly. "Of course, sir. I intend to do everything according to tradition and Christian faith." Throughout this entire conversation, Clara had remained silent, as if her opinion didn't matter in a decision that would completely define her future. But now all eyes turned toward her, waiting for her response. For the first time in her life, she felt she had a real choice to make, a decision that was truly hers, without the constant pressure of being seen as nothing more than a burden. "And you, Clara, do you want to marry this man?" her father asked with an indifference that barely hid his impatience to resolve the matter quickly. Clara looked at Sebastian, studying his serious but kind face. She didn't really know him as well as would be ideal for someone she planned to share her entire life with, but she knew him well enough to understand that he treated her with a respect and dignity she had never experienced before. Perhaps that, more than romantic love or burning passion, was the most solid and lasting foundation for a marriage. However, there was something in Sebastian's eyes that Clara still couldn't fully understand, a mystery that only time would reveal, and that would change her life in ways she could never imagine at that decisive moment. "Yes," Clara finally replied, her voice quiet but firm, echoing in the small room like a declaration of independence. The neighbors, who until then had watched the scene in respectful silence, began to whisper among themselves. The day's gossip had transformed into even juicier news. Clara Valero, the most despised girl in Villaseca, was going to marry the manager of Count Antaro's ranch. It was enough material to fuel conversations for months. The wedding was set for 1 month later, enough time for the simple preparations that the family's financial situation allowed, and for the parish priest from the neighboring village to come and perform the ceremony, since Villaseca didn't have its own church. The news spread through the town like wildfire in dry grass. Within a few days, it was all anyone could talk about. As expected, opinions were sharply divided. A few people expressed genuine happiness for Clara, recognizing that she deserved a chance at happiness after so many years of suffering. But most people didn't hide their envy, disguised as disbelief. Who knows what that man saw in her? Letitia commented at the grocery store while buying fabric for her own wedding dress. He must have some hidden reason, or else he's truly desperate. The Valero house became a hive of activity. Doña Francisca, having gotten over her initial resistance, now threw herself into the preparations, not so much out of love for her daughter, but mainly because of what others would say if the wedding didn't meet the community's minimum expectations. "You need a decent dress," she said, rummaging through a dusty old trunk. "You're not going to get married looking like a beggar." From the back of the trunk, she pulled out a white dress yellowed with age. It had been her own wedding dress, worn only once almost 30 years ago, and then carefully stored away. The dress was old-fashioned and would need considerable alterations, but it was infinitely better than anything Clara owned. It was the first time her mother had offered her something of sentimental value, and Clara received the dress with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Meanwhile, Sebastian carefully prepared the small house on the grounds of Count Antiero's ranch. It was a modest building with 2 rooms, a living room that would also serve as a kitchen, and a bedroom. The bathroom was shared outside with 2 other similar houses where families of ranch workers lived. For Clara, who shared a cramped corner with her siblings in her parents' house, this space would be like a palace, a place where she would finally have privacy and dignity. The wedding day arrived with Clara waking up with a swirling mixture of nervousness, hope, fear, and joy in her chest. For the first time in her life, she would be the center of attention for a positive reason, not as an object of pity or ridicule. The neighbors, now surprisingly helpful, appeared early to help her get ready. Her mother's dress, after the seamstress's skillful alterations, had turned out better than anyone had expected. With a few wild flowers in her hair pulled back in an elaborate bun, and a dusting of rice powder on her face, Clara barely recognized herself in the cracked piece of mirror they had at home. "You actually look like a real person," Doña Francisca commented, which, coming from her, was almost enthusiastic praise. At 10 in the morning, Clara was ready to take the most important step of her life, having no idea that this simple wedding was only the first chapter of a story that would transform her into the most powerful woman in the entire region. The makeshift chapel bell, which was actually just Don Antonio's house courtyard, he had the largest yard in town, began ringing at noon. Clara walked arm in arm with her father through the small gathered crowd, her legs trembling slightly beneath the dress that swayed in the dry breeze. The courtyard had been decorated with colorful streamers and wildflowers, creating a festive atmosphere that contrasted with the usual simplicity of the place. There weren't many formal guests, just the townspeople, a few ranch workers, and, to everyone's absolute surprise, Count Antero himself, sitting quietly in a chair at the back of the courtyard. The old count rarely appeared at public events. He was an extremely private man who ruled his vast lands with an iron fist, but always from a distance. His presence at the wedding of a simple manager caused considerable murmuring among those present. The ceremony was brief and solemn. The parish priest conducted the traditional rituals with respectful efficiency. The vows were exchanged with simplicity and sincerity. The simple wedding rings were placed on each other's fingers with slightly trembling hands. And finally, the gentle kiss, that sealed the union. A modest but warm celebration followed, with food prepared collectively by the village women and music from a local guitarist who knew all the traditional songs of the region. At sunset, as the sun began to set, painting the sky orange and red, the couple headed to their new home on the grounds of Count Antero's ranch. A cart borrowed from a neighbor carried Clara's few belongings, some clothes, her grandmother's medal, 2 or 3 kitchen utensils, and little else. The small house was waiting for them, clean and carefully organized. Sebastian had made a genuine effort to make it welcoming. There were colorful fabric curtains at the windows, a vase of wildflowers on the rustic wooden table, and even a small woven rug on the packed earth floor. It wasn't luxurious or large, but for Clara it represented something she had never had, a true home, a space she could call her own, without fear of being humiliated or rejected. "I hope you like it," Sebastian said, carefully watching his wife's reaction as she slowly explored the 2 rooms. "I know it's not much, but we can improve things over time." Tears rolled down Clara's face, but they weren't from sadness or disappointment. They were from a deep emotion she could barely name, a mix of gratitude, relief, and hope that left her almost breathless. "It's perfect," she replied with complete sincerity, gently touching the colorful curtains. "It's more than I ever dreamed of having." The first few days of marriage gradually transformed into weeks of adjustment and mutual discovery. Sebastian would leave at dawn to supervise work on the ranch, while Clara took care of the house and began to cultivate a small garden behind the property. Sometimes she would bring her husband lunch in the fields, a gesture that the other workers observed with a mixture of respectful curiosity and quiet approval. Their marriage wasn't built on great fiery passions or dramatic romantic declarations. It was built day by day through small gestures of mutual consideration, quiet conversations during simple dinners, and moments of shared silence under the starry sky. Clara discovered that happiness didn't need to be spectacular to be real and lasting. Life on the ranch brought Clara a social dignity she had never experienced in her 25 years of life. She was no longer the Valero spinster or the poor thing nobody wanted. She was now the manager's wife, a position that, although modest, gave her genuine respect that she had never known. When they occasionally went into town for shopping or social visits, Clara noticed the curious looks and whispered comments, but now they contained a note of envy instead of the usual contempt. The months passed quietly, and Clara discovered the small pleasures of an organized and respectful life. For the first time, she had control over her own time and space. She no longer needed to wake up before dawn, to carry heavy buckets of water, or endure constant humiliation from a family who saw her as a burden. One morning, about 6 months after the wedding, something unusual happened. Clara was hanging clothes on the improvised clothesline behind the house when she saw strange activity in the main part of the ranch, elegant carriages, something extremely rare in that isolated region, were raising clouds of dust on the main road leading to the big house. Hours later, Sebastian returned for lunch with a worried expression that Clara couldn't ignore. There was a tension in his shoulders and a shadow in his eyes that she had never seen before. "Has something happened?" she asked as she served him steaming stew. Sebastian hesitated for a long moment before answering, as if carefully weighing his words. "Count Antiero is very ill," he finally said, his voice full of seriousness that made Clara immediately stop what she was doing. "Specialized doctors have come from the capital to examine him. The situation seems quite serious." Clara crossed herself instinctively, as she had learned since childhood. "May the Virgin protect him." "How serious is it?" Sebastian nodded slowly. The doctors spoke of heart problems. "It seems the Count had been in pain for months, but you know his character's stubborn. He doesn't like to show weakness. He only sought help when the situation became really critical. A week after the doctor's arrival, Sebastian was called to the mansion for the first time since the Count's illness had worsened. Clara saw him leave at dawn with visible concern on his face and didn't see him return until dusk, with an expression she couldn't completely understand. "The Count wants to speak with me again tomorrow morning," he said as they ate dinner in silence, alone, with no one else present. Clara found it strange that a dying count would want to have private conversations with a manager. Even acknowledging Sebastian's competence and honesty, a private audience with the sick count seemed like an unusual privilege for someone in his position. The next morning, Sebastian dressed in his best clothes and headed to the big house even before dawn. Clara stayed home doing her household chores with her mind completely elsewhere. Sebastian only returned at dusk, and when Clara saw him approaching the house, she immediately realized that something fundamental had changed. His face was pale, his shoulders carried a tension she had never seen before, and there was a gravity in his eyes that sent a shiver down her spine. "Sebastian?" Clara called carefully, concern evident in her voice. "What happened?" He raised his eyes slowly, looking at her as if he had just woken up from a deep, disturbing sleep. When he finally spoke, his words fell like stones in the silence of the small house. "The Count died 2 hours ago." Clara crossed herself immediately, murmuring a quick prayer for the soul of the deceased. "May God rest him in his holy glory. But what did he want with you? Why those private conversations?" Sebastian took a deep breath, running his hands over his tired face. For an endless moment it seemed like he wouldn't respond, but then his words came out loaded with a weight. Clara couldn't understand. "He wanted me to know the truth before he died." Clara felt her heart speed up. What truth? Sebastian looked directly into her eyes, and what she saw there was a mix of fear, determination, and something that seemed almost like guilt. "Clara, I need to tell you something I've kept secret for a long time. Something about who I really am." The silence that followed was thick like the air before a storm. Clara felt her legs weaken, and she sat slowly in the wooden chair, her eyes fixed on her husband's face, trying to understand what was coming. "My full name is Sebastian de la Roca Antero," he said, each word seeming to weigh tons on his lips. The revelation hit Clara like lightning from a clear sky. The simple man she had married, the humble manager she had met carrying buckets of water, was the son of the most powerful count in the region. It was impossible, absurd, incredible. But at the same time, small details began to make sense in her confused mind. How? Why? Questions rushed through Clara's mind as she tried to process this devastating information. Sebastian reached across the rustic table, gently touching his wife's fingers, as if he wanted to anchor himself to reality through that contact. "It's a long and painful story. My mother was a young woman from a simple family who worked in the big house when she was younger. The Count had a relationship with her. But when he discovered she was expecting a child, he dismissed her from the ranch." Clara listened in silence, trying to absorb every word of this extraordinary revelation. "She raised me alone in a distant city, always telling me who my real father was, but never trying to force recognition. When my mother died last year, I decided to come meet him, to understand my origins, to discover what kind of man he really was." The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together in Clara's mind, forming a completely different picture than the one she had imagined. "So you came to get revenge?" she asked, trying to understand Sebastian's motivations. "No," he replied firmly. "I only came looking for answers, to know the truth about my story. When I introduced myself to the Count as his son, showing him the letters and portraits my mother had kept all those years, he recognized me immediately. He said I was his spitting image as a young man." Sebastian paused, as if reliving that first tense encounter with the father he had never known. He asked me to keep our true relationship secret and suggested I work as a manager to learn about the ranch and so we could get to know each other better without stirring up gossip in the region. He was a proud man, afraid of what people would say about having an illegitimate child. Clara listened, stunned, trying to process not only the revelation itself, but its implications for her own life. A painful doubt pierced her heart like a sharp blade. "And our wedding?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear of the answer. "Was it also part of that plan? Did you marry me just to keep your identity secret?" Sebastian squeezed her hand tighter, his eyes filling with an intensity she had rarely seen. "No, Clara. Meeting you was the only completely unexpected event in this entire complicated story. I married you because I saw a strong, dignified woman with an inner beauty that few could perceive. I never lied about my feelings for you. They were the truest part of all this." There was a sincerity in those words that Clara could feel in her heart, but the magnitude of the revelation was still difficult to fully absorb. "What happens now?" she asked, fearing the answer, but needing to know. "The Count formally recognized me as his son in his will. According to the notary who was present in his last moments, I am his only legitimate heir." The implication of those words hung in the air of the small house like a divine revelation. Heir to Count Antero meant heir to the ranch, to the hundreds of head of cattle, to the lands that extended as far as the eye could see, to the greatest fortune in the entire region. "That means we are—" Clara couldn't finish the sentence, the reality being too much for her mind to process at once. "Rich? Yes," Sebastian replied. "Very rich. But nothing has to change between us if you don't want it to. I will still be the same man you married, Clara. This inheritance doesn't define who I am." The Count's wake was held at the ranch itself, with the presence of political authorities, businessmen, influential people, and merchants from the entire region. To everyone's general surprise and shock, Sebastian was formally presented as the son and sole heir of the deceased. The murmuring was immediate and intense. Some distant relatives of the Count, who had already considered themselves natural heirs to the fortune, couldn't hide their indignation and disbelief. Others, more pragmatic and opportunistic, quickly changed their attitude and began trying to approach the new Count with forced smiles and exaggerated greetings. Clara accompanied all this activity in silence, feeling out of place in her simple dress among so many important and well-dressed people from regional society. She noticed curious looks, whispered comments, and surprised expressions when people discovered she was the new owner's wife. After the funeral, Sebastian and Clara moved to the big house, the imposing headquarters of the ranch that Clara had only known from afar. For her, entering that mansion as its new mistress was a completely surreal experience. The spacious rooms with high ceilings, the antique furniture made of imported hardwoods, the paintings on the walls, the Persian rugs, the fine china, everything contrasted dramatically with the absolute simplicity she had been accustomed to all her life. In the weeks that followed the move to the mansion, Clara faced the immense challenge of adapting to the responsibilities of managing a property of that size. But she made a decision that surprised everyone in the region. Her first major initiative as the new lady of the ranch was to establish a literacy program for the property's workers and their families. She turned one of the smaller rooms in the house into an improvised classroom where a teacher from the neighboring town gave classes for children and adults after the workday. The idea caused amazement and even resistance among some neighboring landowners. Why spend money teaching workers to read? Don Joaquin questioned during one of his now much more frequent visits. Then they get ideas in their heads, want higher wages, start questioning orders. Clara looked at her father with a firmness he had never seen in her before. "Because no one deserves to live in ignorance, father. I know very well what it's like to not have opportunities to learn, and I don't want other people to go through that." Sebastian fully supported his wife's initiative and went further, implementing significant improvements in working conditions on the ranch, increasing wages, building new, more dignified housing for employees, and establishing a small medical clinic to care for workers and their families. Clara especially felt a special responsibility to use her influence to help women who found themselves in the same situation she had been in, despised, without opportunities, treated as burdens by their own families. One of the most significant moments of Clara's new life occurred when Letitia, the same girl who had mocked her during her engagement, appeared at the ranch asking for work. Her situation had changed drastically. Her fiancé from the capital had abandoned her, leaving her with debts and a damaged reputation. She was desperate for work and had nowhere else to turn. Clara could have easily gotten revenge by rejecting the request or offering humiliating conditions. It was exactly the kind of payback many people would have expected from her. But to everyone's surprise, Clara not only offered Letitia work, but did so with dignity and respect. "Everyone deserves a second chance," she said simply. "I know very well what it's like to need one." This gesture of magnanimity definitively consolidated Clara's reputation as a different kind of leader, someone who used power to build rather than destroy. Her ability to forgive and help even those who had humiliated her demonstrated an emotional maturity and strength of character that impressed everyone who knew her. As time passed, Clara gained confidence and presence that surprised even herself. Her natural intelligence and fierce determination helped her quickly overcome her lack of formal education. She hired not only a teacher for the workers, but also a tutor for herself, spending hours studying advanced reading, mathematics, and the basics of administration. The transformation wasn't only external or social. Clara was discovering aspects of her personality that had remained hidden during years of submission and humiliation. The shy and insecure young woman was giving way to a determined woman who knew exactly what she wanted and how to achieve it. But unlike many who experience a sudden change of fortune, Clara didn't allow herself to be corrupted by the power or wealth she now possessed. She used her influence to create real changes in the lives of other women in the region, establishing a fund to help women start small businesses and become financially independent. At night, when Clara and Sebastian sat on the porch of the big house watching the sunset over the lands that now belonged to them, Clara sometimes remembered the desperate woman who had carried buckets of water along the dusty road. The journey from total humiliation to the position of one of the most respected and influential women in the region seemed like an impossible dream. But it had become reality through an extraordinary combination of destiny, true love, and mainly the inner strength she had always possessed, but never had the opportunity to demonstrate. Clara Valero had become much more than the new lady of the ranch. She had transformed into a force for social change, a leader who used her experience of suffering to help others going through the same difficulties. Her story showed that true nobility doesn't come from birth or inherited wealth, but from character, compassion, and the determination to use whatever power you have to make the world a better place for everyone. And so we finish this amazing story that makes us think about life and how destiny can surprise us in the most unexpected ways. Clara Valero proved that it doesn't matter where we come from or how difficult our current situation is. There's always the possibility of transformation when we find people who value us for who we really are. Clara's story teaches us important lessons, that kindness is more powerful than cruelty, that helping others makes us stronger, and that everyone deserves to be treated with respect and dignity, no matter how poor or humble they might seem. What did you learn from Clara and Sebastian's story? What part touched your heart the most? Remember, just like Clara, you have inner strength that can help you overcome any difficulty. Sometimes we just need someone to believe in us, and sometimes we need to be that person who believes in others. The most beautiful part of Clara's story isn't that she became rich, it's that she used her good fortune to help other people and make the world a kinder place. That's the kind of person we should all try to be.